The day is March 5th, 1964. A crowd of 10,000 people march on Frankfort, Kentucky. They are protesting discrimination against blacks in businesses all across Kentucky. They seek the day that the state becomes the first in the South to pass a civil rights bill. In attendance is famed civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., star athlete Jackie Robinson, and the National Council of Jewish Women. Yes, the National Council of Jewish Women. If you ask most people who they believed was involved in the civil rights movement, they may name a few African American activists, Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. They may name some women like Rosa Parks, but they probably wouldn't mention any Jewish women. They may not know that Jewish women had anything to do with the civil rights movement at all. However, Jewish women worked alongside civil rights advocates to aid them in their journey for equality, but their involvement was widely overlooked. Deborah Schultz, the leading expert on Jewish women in the civil rights movement, sums it up well. Quote, "Despite the general consensus that Jews were well represented among those fighting for racial equality in America, Jewish women were barely visible in movement histories." End quote. Jewish solidarity with blacks in the civil rights movement led to a number of advances. About half of the white civil rights attorneys in the 1960s, more than half of the white freedom riders, and nearly 2/3 of the white volunteers in Freedom Summer in Mississippi were Jews. A prominent black activist group, the NAACP, was actually founded in part by Jews, who also made key early contributions to the Congress for Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and other major groups.
If you look at the histories of the civil rights movement, the participation of Jews is always mentioned. Proportionally, Jewish students, for example, were much more likely than other whites to volunteer for things like the freedom rides here in the South. Jewish scriptures teach us to strive for justice. They tell us to defend the weak and the oppressed. Every year we celebrate the main Jewish holiday, the holiday of Passover, which is a holiday about the freeing of the Jewish slaves in ancient Egypt, and that's a very powerful message that all people deserve to be free.
In all of this, the role of women is sparsely mentioned. Even at a time when women were viewed as a softer sex, a fourth of the college students that participated in the freedom rides were women, and according to Schultz, quote, "young white women were certain to inflame white mobs," end quote. This shows that women involved heightened publicity of events like freedom rides to the general public in order to bring about change. If these women were not involved, then reporters may not have covered each freedom ride as thoroughly. All across the country, young women were getting involved in the civil rights movement. Schultz hypothesized that going south provided women with, quote, "adventure, authentic experience, escape from boring jobs, difficult families, and the prospect of marriage," end quote.
I came of age at the time of the rise of the civil rights movement, the very first beginnings back in the late 40s and 50s, early 50s. So I felt immediately, an affinity for that campaign. I felt that I belonged with the people who were demonstrating then for full participation, full citizenship. There were demonstrations here in Louisville, and I was with it.
There's no question, I think, that when it was an issue of recruiting people to go and risk being beaten up and arrested in the South, there was a feeling that that's for the boys, and the women should not be exposed to this kind of thing. But some of them did.
Deborah Schultz lists some avenues of involvement. Quote, "Jewish women worked as campus organizers, fundraisers, demonstrators, desegregators, voter registration workers, field workers and organizers, freedom school teachers, strategists, communication coordinators, human resource managers, economic cooperative organizers, typists, cooks, sympathetic listeners, lawyers, doctors, and social workers," end quote. Unfortunately, the relationship between Jews and their fellow activists was not always amicable. One of the reasons Jews are absent from the mainstream idea of civil rights movement is that there were tensions between leaders within the black community about how other groups could be involved. Some prominent activists wanted to stand more for black power. These activists identified Jews as part of the white community rather than as a similarly oppressed people. Malcolm X said, quote, "Everybody talks about the 6 million Jews, but I was reading a book the other day that showed 100 million of us were kidnapped and brought to this country. 100 million. Now everybody's wet-eyed over a handful of Jews who brought it on themselves. What about our 100 million? End quote. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. was sometimes criticized for expressing solidarity with Jews and other minorities by saying things like, quote, "Our victory will not be a victory for Montgomery's Negroes alone. It will be a victory for justice, a victory for fair play, and a victory for democracy," end quote. He was not only accused of being a communist, a term that held anti-Semitic subtext at the time, but of neglecting his people.
Yeah, there was concern in the Jewish community as the African American movement seemed to be becoming more exclusively black. The ideal that I think most Jews who participated in the civil rights movement thought they were supporting was an integrated society, one where everybody would be, everybody would participate equally. They were not contributing in their minds to a society in which blacks would become increasingly separated from the rest of American society.
The tensions between Jews and blacks may very well be a large reason for why Jews are overlooked in the civil rights movement. However, even within that well-documented history of Jewish involvement, mentions of Jewish women are lacking. It's not that women weren't there, because prominent women have recorded their experiences, and else the National Council of Jewish Women wouldn't be at the March on Frankfurt. Pointing to how their role played into the larger picture of the movement is difficult because it hasn't been widely investigated. This may be due to the nature of the women's involvement and to the traditional attitude of historians towards women. Quote, "The nature of some of their back office work that Jewish women performed for the movement reinforced their invisibility," end quote.
Historians, too, have taken a long time to learn to recognize where women have played an important role in movements. There's no question that women were involved in the civil rights movement, black women and also white women supporters, but as I say, at the time, it was primarily the men who were on the posters up front.
I like to think that my participation was welcome and had some effect on the African Americans who might previously thought that all Jews washed our hands of any participation. Part of that's great because there's so many young, wonderful young women. They don't need me.
In the end, even if concrete advances made by Jewish women in the civil rights movement have been obscured by time and prejudice, it is important to be aware of their involvement. Jewish women were proud to stand up for their beliefs and were widely involved in different jobs during the movement. It is important to notice why their influence has been forgotten so we can be aware of how we shape the way history is remembered. With that knowledge, we can appreciate their legacy and preserve it for the future.